Thank you everyone for returning to the second session of today's York Circle at Home lecture series. For those of you joining the webinar now, welcome. It's a pleasure to come together online for this lecture. My name is Julie Lafford and I'm the Executive Director of Alumni Engagement at York University. For those of you who attended our first session, I realize you've already heard what I'm about to say, so thank you for bearing with me while I go through a few items before we introduce our next speaker. While the world has changed drastically since we hosted our last York Circle event on campus in February, we are pleased to be able to, we are pleased to continue to bring this lecture series in virtual format during the COVID-19 pandemic. As many of you know, York Circle is an opportunity to learn from some of the incredible faculty and researchers here at York. We'll continue that tradition today, as you'll hear from some of the university's leading scholars, many of whom pivoted on their research to studying the varying effects of this pandemic and draw from their own expertise to speak to you today about some of its lasting impacts and how to navigate these changes. And even though we can't gather physically, we hope to continue to offer you programming and events virtually so that we can stay connected during this challenging time. I'd like to first bring you some news from York on the way that we're responding to the pandemic to support our students in our community. The university has launched the COVID-19 Student Relief Fund, an initiative that will raise money to support York University emergency bursaries. These bursaries have been established to help York students cover unexpected housing, rent, food, travel, and other costs due to the pandemic. York has also issued a call for time-sensitive special research projects with COVID-19 focus. Funding in the amount of $250,000 will be provided by the university. Additionally, researchers and staff at York have come together to respond to the call for supplies to help Canada and Ontario combat COVID-19. York has already donated over 60,000 medical supplies from the faculties of Science, Health, and the School of Arts, Media, Performance, and Design. Although we aren't all in the same location now, I would still like to acknowledge that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, and this territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Thank you all again for joining us remotely today. Before we begin, I want to take a quick poll, which should appear on your screen very shortly. And the question asks, have you ever attended a York event other than the one right now? The poll should pop up on your screen, and I'll just give everybody a moment to respond to that. Thank you for taking the time to respond to that. I see that we have 115 people on the webinar right now, and then I understand we have about a dozen on Facebook already, and I'm sure we'll have a few more join over the next few minutes. So it's great to have so many of you here. So we've got the results of the poll. 62% have attended a York event before, and 35 people have not. So I just want to welcome the 35 people to your first York event. Thank you for joining us, and welcome back, the rest of you. I know that some of you may be new to online events, so if at any time you need help with this experience or you have questions about the content, feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and our team is ready to help. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rebecca Pillay-Riddell. She's the Academic Chair of the York Circle Lecture Series and the Associate Vice President of Research for the University and a Professor in the Faculty of Health. Welcome, Dr. Pillay-Riddell. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Julie. Good morning and welcome, everybody. For those of you joining us again from our first session, welcome back. For those of you who this is the first session of your Saturday morning, welcome. I hope everybody is staying safe and well during this time. As Julie mentioned, my name is Dr. Rebecca Pillay-Riddell. I am the Academic Chair of the York Circle Lecture Series and Associate Vice President Research. I'm so pleased to be able to introduce the second York Circle at Home lecture series this morning. We have our first lecture under our belt and it went really well despite challenges everywhere. So I think that I want to repeat how it makes me so optimistic that we can really embrace technology and come together with connectedness to get through these challenging times. So our next lecture will be Dr. Julia Creet's lecture on the genealogical sublime. This will be followed by two more timely and thought-provoking lectures and research presentations this afternoon. As a heads up, the first lecture is Dr. Jane Heffernan's lecture, What's in a Model? A Look at COVID-19, which will occur at 1:45 p.m. This lecture will then be followed right after by Dr. Ada Mamuji, Dr. Jack Rozdolinsky, and doctoral candidate Terry Chu's lecture, Understanding Lived Experiences During COVID-19, Chinese Diaspora Communities in the Greater Toronto Area, which will take place at 3 p.m. I'm so proud to be able to support all the wonderful people and staff in York Circle to bring together these highly recognized and respected professors and school scholars over Zoom today to share their research with all of you. We're all here making history. First time to have our York Circle this way. As Julie said, while we cannot meet in person during the pandemic, we're very honored to have this time and ability and platform to share our incredible faculty and researchers at York. I'm so grateful that Julia, Jane, as well as Ada, Jack, and Terry could join us today. I know you will learn so much from their presentations. Now I'm pleased to switch my introduction to Dr. Julia Creet, Professor of Department of English at York. Dr. Creet, there she is a leading international scholar in cultural memory studies. Last year, she received the York President's Research Impact Award in 2019. For those of you who are not familiar, this is York's highest honor for those who've made a notable impact on our communities and are contributing greatly to the university's culture, research culture, intensity, and reputation. She received her work for her research on digital privacy and mining, genealogy, and memory. Dr. Creet is a co-author of the book Memory and Migration, Multidisciplinary Approaches to Memory Studies, and H.G. Adler, Life, Literature, and Legacy. She also has produced and directed 2 documentary films. Welcome, Dr. Creet. Thank you so much for joining us today from your home.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. And thank you so much for inviting me to address the York Circle and beyond. And I'm delighted to see that there are many people who have come to the York Circle for the first time. Some of you are here because I reached out and invited you. And so I'm very grateful that you've taken the time to hear what I have to say about my new book, which I would not recommend launching a book during a pandemic. Nonetheless, so this is a really wonderful opportunity to talk to you about this research, which is the next step in a series of works about family history and genealogy. So what I'll do today is I'll tell you a bit about how the book came to be. The origin story of the book itself is, I think, fairly engaging. And then why I chose such a complicated title for it. I'll explain the title. So to start, this is a book about databases. That might not be entirely clear from the title. Why would I write about databases? Well, because genealogy has become, it's become an enterprise of databases. So this book is about the longest database in the world, which belongs to, or the longest genealogy in the world, which is that of Confucius. The largest database in the world, which is owned by the Mormon Church, the Church of the Latter-day Saints. The most complete database in the world, which has been assembled by Íslenska Bók in Iceland. The most lucrative database in the world, which is Ancestry.com, and the most rapidly growing databases, which are the genetic genealogy databases. My work in family history started because I was compelled to discover the details of my own family, and particularly of a sort of family secret. I found that process completely compelling to the point of being quite obsessive. I spent about 10 years trying to piece together my mother's history, and very briefly, because, you know, that in itself could be a 3-hour conversation. She'd been a Hungarian Holocaust survivor who decided to forget. She did her very best to forget. It's hard to forget being Hungarian. It's a strong accent. But turns out it's relatively easy to hide being Jewish and to hide traumatic histories. So we grew up without knowing anything really about what had happened to her. After she died, as is often the case, details of her life started to surface. And I was so puzzled by why she had decided to be silent or to try and forget that I spent about a decade trying to put the story back together, to provide a narrative for myself and for my siblings as much as anything else. In that process, I made my first documentary called Mum. Ben, if you wouldn't mind putting up the image. Well, there we have the image of the book, but yes. So Mum, as I say, was part in the description, part a literary detective story and part personal journey. And it was a very, very compelling process. And so I understand deeply the motivations of family history, the things that motivate people, the absent histories, the breaks, the traumas, you know, the adoption, just wanting to feel connected to a larger group of people. And the excitement of historical research, because it is one of the largest historical enterprises in the world, because so many people do it. As I was coming to the end of my project, I looked around me, and this was now in the early 2000s, and I looked around me and I thought, I'm not alone. There are so many people who are doing this. So I realized that I was part of a zeitgeist. I was a creature of my time, as we all are. But I began to wonder whether there were other forces that were driving me, you know, something that I had thought was so deeply personal and so individual. If so many other people were doing it, were there other motivations? So I decided to make a second documentary called Data Mining the Deceased. Ben, if you wouldn't mind putting the image up. And this documentary, I decided that I would investigate some of the largest genealogical databases in the world. Because it had really struck me that genealogy was no longer a question of going to an archive, finding a paper here and there, of patient research, of painstaking research, that it had become an enterprise of database research. Because in the early 2000s, that's when the databases first started to go online. As I had come to the end of my own project, I came across a story by a Yugoslav writer, and I am an English professor. So part of my part of my motivations are always narrative. I had come across a story by a Yugoslav writer called The Encyclopedia of the Dead. And Danilo Kish had written this story about an archive buried underneath in this cave underneath the Swedish library, of all places, the Swedish National Library. And in that cave, some cast of erudite historians were gathering the records of every person who had ever lived in the name of biblical biblical resurrection. We might be facing a biblical insurrection as well. Danilo Kish wrote this story in the late 1970s. In the early 1980s, he republished the story in a collection of stories called The Encyclopedia of the Dead. And in that edition of the story, there was a footnote. Yes, this is where the literary scholarship comes in. And the footnote said, Kish wrote in the footnote, you know, I had thought that this story was entirely imaginary, that I had invented this story. And then I read an article in a Yugoslav magazine under the title of Archives that described an archive in the United States, blasted out of stone, that housed the names of 16 billion people and counting. And he said, I realized that my story, in fact, existed in reality. Well, that story was I think the thing that well, it was my introduction to the Mormon Project. So I decided that I wanted to go interview the executives of the database, which is called Family Search database, to find out why they were collecting the records. And that started the documentary project. And then I went to Iceland to talk to people who were amassing the information from Icelandica book. Then I talked to the founders of Ancestry to find out why they had started their database. And at the end of the documentary, it became very, very clear that what had started as a very personal journey for so many people had become an intensely technological enterprise, and one that had many stakeholders that had interests quite different than ordinary family historians or genealogists. For Iceland, for example, the database was being amassed by Decode Genetics that was using Iceland genealogy and genetics to look for the genetic causes of common and uncommon diseases. And Iceland has one of the richest genealogical histories in the world, and also a very homogeneous population. So that was a private database that had used public information. The Mormons were amassing the information for the purposes of posthumous baptism, for the purposes of baptizing essentially everyone in the world, or everyone who they have ever, who they can confirm has ever lived, in the interests of preparing everyone for the second coming. Ancestry was amassing the information, obviously, for profit. And Ancestry was started by Mormon entrepreneurs, and they used the Mormon records to begin their database as well as public records. The Confucius database, because the Confucius genealogy was turned into a database as well, and this I discovered as I was doing the research for the book. The Confucius database was established in order as an exercise in soft power, to in effect burnish China's image in the world. So Confucius was resurrected. Mao Zedong called him a stinking, rotten corpse, and yet he was resurrected in the interests of a new sort of public face of China. And then, again, as I continued the research for the book, it became very clear, and this started to become clear to me during my research for the documentary as well, that the majority of the genetic genealogy research, the direct-to-consumer genetic genealogy research, was being sold to the pharmaceutical industry. So every database had an end use that had very little to do with, as I say, ordinary family historians and genealogists. And I thought that this was let me back up a bit. I've screened data mining the deceased around the world. It's been on TVO I think they've broadcast it 25 times now. That's a cheap television hour, I have to say. But I've spoken, I've toured it around the world, and I've spoken to audiences and lots of Q&A, and very few people understand that every one of these databases has a radically different stakeholder than the people who use them. So I wanted to expand my research from the documentary into the book that is now the Genealogical Sublime. Why did I call it that? It's it's a book that I really wanted to write for a crossover audience, but I couldn't resist. I couldn't resist a kind of opaque title, so I hope you forgive me for that. The title, the two terms in the title have very different histories. So I'll address each of them. So genealogical obviously derives from both the practice of genealogy, but it has another meaning. In the humanities, its second meaning is derived essentially from Michel Foucault's historiographical approach, which is called the genealogical approach. And Foucault, sort of via Nietzsche, argued that the things that we assume are most innate are the things that we should really question historically. So genealogy and family history, so many of the people I've talked to, when I asked them, well, what motivated you? Why do you do it? They couldn't answer that question. I just need to know, they said. It just feels innate. It just feels like something I really need to know. So I thought carefully about that, and I thought, well, can we question something without a history? Can we question genealogy or this need for pedigree or ancestry? Are these absolutely innate needs, or can we historicize them in some way? And my effort to historicize them was really to put them in the context of these new databases and these new technologies, because something radically shifted when we moved to database technologies to do genealogy. And it's always been a technological enterprise, but in the sense that, it has come and gone in different cultures in different ways. It's always embedded in narrative. It's embedded in different kinds of recording systems. But we took, I think, a very strong turn when we started to put records online and to sample DNA as well. So that's the first part of the term. It's a play on the notion of genealogy, both to do family history and to question the origins of doing family history. The second term, the sublime, well, it's got a 2,000-year history. It started as an aesthetic term, something that was so beautiful that words could not express. And then in the 18th century, it took a turn to something sort of darker. When Kant redefined it as something that we find, again, beautiful beyond words, but also awesome, but not in the kind of contemporary, like, oh, that's awesome, but something that produces a sense of awe. That is, we're afraid of it at the same time. It produces both wonder and terror. I began to think about the databases as these sublime exercises, and genealogy, using genealogy through the databases as a sublime exercise, in the sense that every database that I looked at aspired to be the most complete it could possibly be, ever expanding, ever gathering records. And that's what hooked us into it, that we could get more and more and more and more records. and that the DNA worked similarly, that the DNA was examining smaller and smaller and smaller parts of us in order to connect us to larger and larger and larger and larger networks of people. Well, when you start to look at the mathematics of this, and one of the things that Kant described was called the mathematical sublime, where we encounter numbers that are larger than we can possibly imagine. Now, when we start to think about ourselves in relation to other people, and again, particularly with respect to DNA, we take this as the essence of who we are. And yet the essence of who we are is described in smaller and smaller and smaller particles that are connected to ever growing numbers of other people. So if we really stop to think about it, in both the databases and in our own biology, we are smaller and smaller data points on ever growing databases. That's an idea that produces a sense of awe, that we are such a small point in such a large scale of information. But at the same time, it produces a sense of fear. We are such a small point in such a vast history of everyone who's ever lived on Earth. So how do we negotiate that idea of the sublime and the idea that we have been brought to that through technology? So technology has fundamentally changed how we think about ourselves in relation to human history. Again, it's both a good thing. It deepens our understanding of our place in human history, but it also produces a sense of insignificance or fear, which is exactly the opposite of what we look to when we do genealogy, when we're looking for a sense of self and connectedness. So I tried to put these two things together: a history of this idea that we need ancestors, that we need to be related to other people, and this intensely technologically focused gathering of records and information. As it turns out, again, the genetic databases in particular have now pivoted to serve all kinds of other interests. And that has produced a kind of very worrying set of privacy concerns. If any of you are genealogists, you'll know that the largest public database in the US, which was called GEDmatch, to which all kinds of people who had done their tests with other major companies like Ancestry and 23andMe had uploaded their information to GEDmatch in order to get more matches. In other words, to avoid the privacy restrictions of the commercial databases. In 2018, some clever genealogists and some clever detectives figured out that they could use GEDmatch to track down cold cases. There was a privacy storm that erupted when people discovered that, in fact, information that they had thought was purely for a benign use, which was to find other family members, was now being used for law enforcement. Even if it was being used for a very noble purpose, it had been accessed without anybody's anticipation that the information could be used that way. This has now intensified to the point where GEDmatch was sold to a company called Verigen, which is a company that manufactures forensics equipment for law enforcement. So we didn't anticipate, and there was no way we could have anticipated how that information might be used. And I think that brings me to the point that I'd like to make about the exercise in general, which is the question which drives the entire enterprise is really, the question is, who do you think you are? And we know that there's been a very successful television series with that title. It's franchised all over the world. It started in the UK, but it's now franchised everywhere. And it's a really interesting question, because it's a question that is both pressing, who do you think you are? And we all respond to that by saying, well, I think I know who I am. I could know more about who I am. Gee, maybe if I do this DNA test, I'll know even more about who I am. But it's also a very pernicious question. It's a question that puts us in a very difficult position, because it suggests that we don't know who we are. And that in order to know who we are, we have to buy information about ourselves, and in the process, give away a great deal of information about ourselves. There was a recent study that said that there's enough DNA information in the public sphere that 60% of the Caucasian or white population of the United States could now be identified by the information, by the DNA information that was in publicly accessible databases. So we have to think very carefully about the balance between our need to know who we are and how much information we give away about ourselves in the process, and to whom and for what purpose. And I'll just conclude by saying, what started as I think a very benign and kind of necessary exercise, not exercise, but a deep human need, has pivoted towards something not quite so benign, and now really serves a host of other interests, and that it would really do us, these are things we should think deeply about. And to end on a somewhat philosophical note, one of the purposes of all these databases is actually to fend off death itself. And if you think that that's an outrageous claim, it's worth coming back to the Mormon database. And Ben, if you could just throw up the last two slides. This is a card from, this is a baptism card from the Mormon database, and you can see it's got a barcode on one end. And so what happens is that the Mormons allow someone who is living, if they have accurate records of someone who has died, it allows someone who is living to go into the baptismal font and be baptized on their behalf, so that, again, one day they can be resurrected. So that's very clearly an impulse to, in fact, to no longer be dead. I'm not sure how else to put it, to be resurrected. And if you put up the final slide, Ben, you can see, I love this. This is a software legacy family tree. And you can see the relationship here between this pedigree chart and the pedigree chart that reaches to heaven. So the metaphysical or the spiritual aspects of doing this kind of research reach forward and backward, in the sense that it writes us into the record for eternity. But one of the largest medical studies as well that's ever been done using the genetic information was done for the purposes of looking for the markers of longevity. In other words, can we use this information to forestall death itself? So it's a complicated set of demands, interests, stakeholders, needs, and technology. And what I tried to do was to integrate all of those things in a book that is, I hope, accessible. The case studies, I think, are fairly accessible. If you need to skip the introduction, go ahead. You can read the book without the introduction. It's funny, I was rereading it recently and I thought, I set out to write a book for a general audience, and dear, you know, the scholar in me just couldn't quite let it happen. At any rate, I very much appreciate having a chance to talk to you today. And I would love to hear any questions that you might have. And once again, thank you to the York Circle for inviting me to give this talk.
It was our pleasure entirely, Dr. Creet. Thank you for being here. It was really, really thought-provoking. And I wanted to suggest, if you ever get tired of being a professor of English, I think you'd be a pretty good philosopher. So now we have
philosophers would agree, but thank you.
Well, okay. The lay person, you know, might agree with me. I now have time. We have just under 10 minutes to turn things over to the audience for Q&A. We've already received a question about purchasing your book, viewing your documentaries, and my colleague Ben has posted in the chat or the Q&A where to find both of those things. So
I have a website, juliacreet.com.
Yes, that's there too. Perfect. Yeah, that's great. And that's where the documentaries live?
Yeah, you can find links to the documentaries there. They're on Vimeo, but the links are there. And the book order information is there as well. And yes, use that discount code.
Yes, thank you. I have a question from Stephanie Anderson, who asks, is law enforcement in Canada using this type of information? And can you tell us of any cases?
I'm not so sure about Canada, interestingly enough. I think there have been a few cases, but the majority of the cases have been in the States. You know, most of the information in the database is, particularly in GEDCOM, the majority of it are, the majority of the users are from the US. And so the database information is only as good as the people who have uploaded their information. And this is true of any commercial database. So if you submit your DNA to be tested, and you submit it to Ancestry, and you submit it to 23andMe, and maybe Family Tree DNA, you'll get 3 different sets of results back. And that's because these are all proprietary databases. And so they all have different sets of measurements. They have different sets against which they test your DNA. So GEDCOM is, again, it's primarily a US database. And I'm not sure how useful it would be for Canadian law enforcement.
Great, thank you for that. I have a message from Françoise, who is a philosopher, and agrees that Julia can join the Philosopher's Society. So there you go. You've been endorsed. I'd like to know if you believe consumers really realize the ramifications of handing their DNA over to commercial testing companies, because I think we're aware of it, but I don't know that anyone spends any time thinking about what that really means.
No, I mean, the appeal of those companies is it's so strong. How can you resist the idea that all you have to do is spit in a tube, send it off, and you're going to find out, what percentage Neanderthal you are? Well, I can tell you that several members of my family have a large percentage of Neanderthal. I mean, it's a joke, but they've gone back and forth about whether we're related to the Neanderthals or not. On some level, the industry itself calls itself an industry of recreational genomics, right? Okay, that's great. It's recreational because we use that information, again, to tell stories about ourselves. It all comes back to story. I interviewed one of a guy named Corey Mayerink in Salt Lake City, and he'd been a professional genealogist for 40 years. And he said to me, "We are stories. We've been stories since, our ancestors were writing on cave walls." So it's no different with the DNA. The idea that we want to tell a story about ourselves is absolutely compelling. But I don't think people understand the extent to which that information is being monetized. 23andMe doesn't make any money off the $99 that it charges to send to, give you your results. All of its money is being made on the back end, selling that information to the pharmaceutical industry. The idea that GEDCOM was bought by a forensics equipment manufacturer in order to have a complete circle of DNA information to testing equipment to results for the police. Not a lot of people know that if you were not in sort of family history circles or genealogy circles, not a lot of people know that database no longer belongs to the people who started it. Almost all of the genealogy databases started off as sort of grassroots enterprises, and they've all been privatized and commodified. So every time you use one of these databases, you're giving away as much information as you're gaining. But people really don't want to think about that, because that would mean that we would have to question the enterprise itself, and we don't really want to.
Right. Thank you for that. I have a question from Jennifer Hanlon. Jennifer asks, if someone uses a service such as this, I won't name the product itself, to determine their genetic history, do insurance companies have access to that information, and can they use it towards future health or life insurance claims? It's a good one.
Yeah. So that's everyone's concern, really, is that sooner or later the insurance industry will get their hands on that information. Now, we have stronger privacy protections in Canada than we do in the States, but those databases reside in the States. None of the databases are in Canada. What happens with insurance companies, and here's where it gets really interesting, is that if you've submitted your results to one of these testing companies and you've done it for medical purposes, right? So 23andMe and now Ancestry, they will give you medical information as well as your ancestry information. So you get medical information that says that you have a higher likelihood of developing heart disease, for example. There's indications that there's a pre-existing condition. You apply for medical insurance, and the insurer says to me, do you have any known pre-existing conditions? If you don't disclose the information that you now have learned from this test, that's a possible out.
Pardon me, that's my computer chiming at me.
Who might very well say, well, you've had this DNA test and you knew that you were at high risk for a particular disease. So it's not, at this point, the insurance companies don't have access to that information. But it's everyone's worry. And I think it will be difficult in the long run for those tests to remain sort of out of the hands of the insurance companies.
Thank you so much for that, and great question, Jennifer. Thank you for asking. I'm actually going to wrap things up for now. I see we're just to time. Dr. Creet, thank you again for being here. This is a really interesting and thought-provoking questions that you raise, and I'm really pleased to be able to bring it to our York Circle members today. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Great.